I want to thank the Foundation for inviting me here. It's been a couple of years that we've been trying to arrange this, and as far as I'm concerned, no time like the present. I want to talk to you today about ideas that I hope are going to contribute both to our thinking around geography, intelligence, the marriage of the two, and I also want to leave time for questions, so I want to just jump right into it. You know, your theme is the revolution, right? The GEOINT revolution, and I want to talk to you about one of the revolutions that I've been observing that underpins all of this, and it is the connectivity revolution. There are two things that we have been doing as mankind, as a species, for 60,000 years. We've been fighting lots of wars, there have been all sorts of disturbances and plagues and horrendous events. We disagree on so many things, but there are exactly two things that all of humanity has been doing collectively, organically, inadvertently, subconsciously, but simultaneously for 60,000 years. Urbanization and infrastructure. Moving into cities and building connectivity across those cities. That's it. We don't have to agree on anything else, but this map shows you that that is true. So, I liken the global infrastructural expansion that has been taking place, particularly in the last 100 years, to building a technological exoskeleton onto the human body. And I think of all infrastructure as falling generally into three categories: transportation, energy, and communications. So of course, there are the highways and railways and bridges and tunnels and so forth. There's the oil and gas pipelines and electricity grids, and now the newest layer of infrastructure, the one that we all take for granted when we hear the word connectivity, it is of course digital connectivity through the internet cables, satellites, and so forth. So all of this collective infrastructural build-out represents a scale so enormous that it outnumbers the kilometers of borders in the world by about 150 to 1. About 75 million kilometers of infrastructure, if you will, that connect the nodes of humanity, our societies and our cities, and only about 500,000 kilometers of borders. And this is just the beginning of the revolution. A lot of the maps that we produce for this book, or all of them, of course, are static, two-dimensional. But I find that in order to track the world's infrastructure development today, you need a living, real-time atlas. So we've been creating this thing called the Connectivity Atlas, which you can find online. It's just in a beta form. But it allows you to look at how you can toggle, slide across continents. You can click in and out of different categories of infrastructure, like energy, transportation, communications, and so forth. And you can see everything that we have made and built, these very firm, sort of permanent structures, if you will. And this is the Connectivity Atlas. And to me, it is the embodiment of our growing capacity for topographical engineering, to modify the planet in a way that suits our human needs as a collective of 7-8 billion people. Now, to me, this represents a paradigmatic shift in human organization. We have been accustomed for centuries to thinking of the world as primarily organized according to the division between states. And we will always have nations and states and empires and various tribal communities. Have no doubt about that. At the same time, we are building these massive volumes of infrastructure across them. So much so that the projections are that we will spend upwards of 2 times, perhaps 3 times, even 4 times as much money as a worldwide community on infrastructure every year than we do across all of the military budgets in the world combined. About a steady $2 trillion a year in global defense expenditure, but a projected 8 trillion or more potentially on infrastructure spending. It's already at about the 2 to 1, 2.5 to 1 mark when it comes to infrastructure to defense. So that actually has an impact on how we think of ourselves as a society of nations and how we relate to one another, and that's the purpose of this book, is to explore all of the consequences of connectivity. Now, it's particularly the last 100 years that matter the most. The United States led the world in infrastructure spending in the early 20th century, particularly coming into and out of World War I. We needed it even more with the Depression, the rise of Keynesian economics. That then spread to Western Europe after World War II, where what we call the Wirtschaftswunder, Germany's resurrection after World War II, was led very much by its infrastructure spending. More recently, in decades that we can all remember very well, we've been witnessing the rise of Asian tiger economies of Southeast Asia and particularly China. And they have now led the world in infrastructure spending, and they are the reason, Asian economies in particular, the reason why that global infrastructure spending level is rising so fast. So we move into a world in which connectivity shapes relations between states more than the lines that divide them. And that infrastructure, because it is something that's fixed and tangible, it has what we call extra statecraft, which is just another way of saying it has a certain kind of authority. It changes the way in which states relate to each other, and it augments the political geography that we are so used to thinking about with functional geography. Now when we think about the map of the world, we have to look at the lines that connect us as much as the lines that divide us, and think about whether or not those lines promote cooperation, as they do in many cases, or whether those lines are in fact the battlefield of the 21st century, which they also are. They already are, and are going to be more and more because they are so lucrative. And I'm going to walk you through some images of that very, very shortly. So I said, urbanization and connectivity. So that was the baseline. Let's get into the urbanization. This is a far more accurate map of who the human species is, where we are, and what we do than the Rand McNally maps that hang on many of your walls. Because it tells you where every single human being is, it shows you their population density, with yellow being the most dense geographies, and we've superimposed these ovals that show you what the megacity clusters are. So the most populous geographies in the world are here. So this is global human geography right here. But very importantly, what we've also added are the circles that give you a sense of just how weighty those cities are, those principal cities are, relative to their national economies. In most countries of the world, most of the emerging markets, frontier geographies, the post-colonial world, the places that we're fixated on right now when we think about the global threat environment and the theaters where we're engaged militarily, are in geographies where one city defines the entire fate of the nation and is the driving force in the economy. And it is particularly these oval cities, these ovals, I call them archipelagos, because cities, of course, are not simply just the little dots on our traditional maps. Instead, they're these long, stretched out archipelagos that reach hundreds of kilometers and can have upwards of 70, 80 million people in them. Here's a different way of looking at it. This is moving from human geography to the simple satellite view. You can see the world's 50 principal megacities of today, and these are the projections out to the year 2030, whether it's the United Nations or the World Bank or management consultancies. They predict we'll have about 50 megacities in the world, and these are them. And you can see, of course, most of them are particularly in Asia. What I find fascinating, though, is we have to remember that if you're going to be a megacity in the year 2030, you probably already are one today, right? As rapidly as urbanization is happening, most of these megacities already have such huge populations that they already meet that test. So when you travel to a megacity, let's say you're arriving in Jakarta or Manila or Nairobi or Sao Paulo, you realize after your 8 or 10 hours of sitting in traffic that you've crossed, well, either if you're very unfortunate, you've gone absolutely nowhere, which has happened to me more than enough times. But as you inch your way across a megacity, you find that you're experiencing many different kinds of environments at the same, over the course of that day or week. You have the economic stratification of medieval cities, where there's a protected core where wealthy people live, where the financial district may be. You have the industrial quarter. You'll have the financial center. You'll have a services hub. You'll have the slums. And you'll have the residential areas for the masses. And all of these things are mashed together in the geography of an urban archipelago. Because when you're talking about not just 10 or 12 million people, the largest cities of the Western world, London, Los Angeles, and so forth, have only about 10 to 15 million people in their greater metropolitan areas. In Asia, you can have 70 or 80 million people in those environments. So you have to get used to thinking of a city as not even being aesthetically or visually one thing. It is all of these things at the same time. It's many cities at once. Now, of course, one of the newer, or I would say recurring themes in thinking about military interventions is the urban environment. We've gone from thinking about urban guerrilla warfare to urbanization as more of a socioeconomic problem to, again, as a security threat. It never went away. It's come back in new ways. We can witness in the context of this extreme economic and social stratification in urban environments that there is a growing backlash and there is a growing amount of urban violence. You have to break it, of course, into two categories. There is that which stems from political unrest based on economic inequalities. So we're seeing that right now in Brazil with its politics. We've seen it in New Delhi. We see it in many developing countries. In Istanbul today, for example, or even in Paris, where new movements bringing together disenfranchised and unemployed youth, as well as restless migrants are coming together to cause a political volatility there. And then, of course, there's actual terrorism that we've seen in Nairobi, we've seen it in Moscow, we see it unfortunately, even in our own capitals in the Western world. And I think we have to clearly separate the urban violence that is proliferating on the basis of economic issues versus that which can be political and have an international military or terrorist sort of dimension. Both are happening at the same time, but we have to be careful not to over-securitize the socio and economic kinds of unrest, which is very much about public policy and investment and education and jobs, versus that which is fundamentally military and political in nature. But that said, there is no doubt in my mind from all of my travels in megacities that there is something of a global underclass revolt that is underway. Won't get into how that plays into our politics here. I will simply say that inequality is a permanent feature of our times, certainly statistical inequality, and the solution to it, if there is one, is to focus on poverty and the bottom 20 or 30% of a country's income earners, and I see very few countries in the world today that have anything like a viable strategy to cope with their underclass, especially given the pace of urbanization. So we have to think about this very seriously as a policy problem that has consequences for us and for our community. Now let me get into the connectivity a bit more, looking at things region by region. I insist very much that we change the way our maps are constructed to emphasize connectivity as much as division. Because as I said before, the infrastructures that we have built and are building are very, very robust features that will outlive many of the nations that they cross, and that's particularly true in the post-colonial world. Here in North America, we have to appreciate to the extent to which we are very connected with our neighbors. The next few maps are taken straight from the book, so you don't have to take pictures of them. They're all there. We get electricity from Canada. We have freight railway connections with Canada. We have robust energy trade and pipelines with Canada. We should be building the second bridge from Detroit to Windsor, Ontario with Canada. More connectivity with Canada is a very good thing for our economy and for theirs. So the 49th parallel doesn't really tell us a lot about US-Canada relations. Certainly thinking about the infrastructure connections tells us a lot more. The same is actually true with Mexico. Right now, Mexico is considered by most economists to be a high-growth market, and the way in which you stabilize the unrest that is most certainly there in countries like that is to invest more in those countries to help to generate more economic growth. And that's actually what a lot of American companies are doing. They're investing in the Mexican automobile sector, in the energy industry, which is just liberalized. We're selling gas and oil to Mexico because it's growing so quickly, even though they're such a large producer themselves. If we think about relations with Mexico in terms of the huge amount of bilateral trade, the people-to-people movements, the energy sector, the automotive sector, and thousands of other jobs and industries and bilateral flows of capital, we wouldn't really be fixated on the issue of whether or not there's going to be a wall or not a wall. Even if there were one, it's completely irrelevant to the deeper connections that have been proven to be mutually beneficial over time. We can talk a lot more about that. I just want to point out that around the world, this is a growing phenomenon, especially the post-colonial world. I spend most of my time traveling in the 150 countries that were born after World War II. Right? Most of the countries in the world are products of decolonization. And these are those small or large, but certainly they are all poor, they are all weak, they are all overpopulated. And in all of those countries, we are now 3 or even 4 generations past the original leadership that saw as its original mandate anti-colonialism, fierce nationalism, socialism, hostility with their neighbors, the desire to demarcate borders, and to strengthen their own sovereignty. Now, 3 or 4 generations later, leaders are saying, that was useful then, but today we have to think about functional geography. How are we going to maximize our geography, our resources, our trade in order to develop our society? And they're realizing that the way to do that is to build more connectivity. So the ancient Grand Trunk Road, which has its origins long predating European colonialism, literally 2,000, 3,000 years ago, there are traces of a trade corridor stretching from Kabul all the way to Calcutta. Today, despite all the animosity between Afghanistan and Pakistan, Pakistan and India, India and its neighbors, you actually have an effort underway to create a most favored nation trade agreement between India and Pakistan, to resurrect this ancient trade corridor, and to extend it further through Bangladesh into Myanmar. This is just one example of a growing trade corridor, even across hostile neighbors, because they're measuring the benefits of connectivity. And even as they fight over borders, they're still trying to trade across them more than ever before. Southeast Asia is definitely the most robust example of this in the developing world, and obviously a very important geography for all of us looking at grand strategy. Here is a region that, if you think about our recent history and memories of the region in the immediate aftermath of the Vietnam War, certainly qualifies as underdeveloped and shattered in many ways. And yet today, this region, whose economic potential could have easily been measured just in the few billions 30 years ago, now has, and in ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, which I now call a Pax Asiana, a sort of a zone of peace, at least internally, you have 650 million people. So it's less than half the population of India, but a higher GDP. Its GDP is now more than $2 trillion, these 10 countries. 650 million people. It also has, of course, less than half the population of China, and it gets more foreign investment than China. The world's factory floor is shifting from China, what it was through the 1980s and 90s, towards Southeast Asia. So that's a very remarkable trend. And why is it happening? It's happening because these countries are integrating. They're saying, again, we've had decades and generations of hostility over our borders, over our political relations, but instead, we're now going to focus on building oil pipelines, gas pipelines, electricity grids, fusing our supply chains together, trading more with each other, and so on, and forging new trade agreements. They even now have free labor mobility across this zone of 650 million people. So if you think that walls and borders are going up, just because in Europe they're saying the Schengen Agreement needs to be put on hold, if you want to cross between Austria and Germany, you may have to show your passport, things like this, just remember that that's not representative of what the world is doing. What the world is doing collectively as a whole is still bringing down borders in huge, huge steps, such as passing free mobility among 700 million people here. And you can see the same thing happening across Africa and other geographies, because they're realizing that connectivity is the path to growth. Even in Africa, and most human cross-border migration today is not them coming to us. It's not Latin Americans coming to the United States. It's not Arabs and Africans going to Europe. Most cross-border migration in the world is just Africans moving around African countries, or people from other post-colonial regions like South Asia moving to the Middle East or Africa. That circulation of people across the southern hemisphere is most of what is human migration today. And again, another example of countries that are learning that decades of hostility over more or less meaningless, particularly in Africa and the Middle East, arbitrary boundaries is not the path towards progress and economic growth, but rather fusing themselves together into economic clusters, particularly in East Africa, which you can see on the right-hand side, where the countries of Kenya and Uganda, Tanzania, Rwanda, Ethiopia, and so forth are building a lot of trade corridors with each other. sharing their energy supplies and so forth in order to maximize their economic potential and attract investment. And you can see this in the rise of new diplomatic institutions like the East African Community. African countries as a whole have pledged to move towards a free trade area by the year 2017 or 2018. Now they won't get there, they'll just get there bit by bit, increment by increment, but the locus of that is in East Africa, and it's very, very promising. So, today being the 100th anniversary of the Sykes-Picot Agreement, it's worth reflecting on this region that has consumed us for most certainly the last 15 years, and for many of us a lot longer than that. And this is obviously not the current map of the Middle East's functional geography. This is not a map of every electricity grid, oil pipeline, railway, trade corridor, water canal, and so forth in the Middle East. But it should be, because I think we, all of us know our history of exactly the last 100 years and the ways in which the various iterations of boundary drawing in this region have failed to produce a stable map. I don't need to educate anyone further on that. What I do think is that whether we're talking about the future map of Syria or whether to partition Iraq, we should heed the lesson of 100 years ago and 60 years ago and even more recently and realize that that alone is just not going to stabilize this region, right? Where our efforts, where the international community's money, where the Arab world's oil revenues, to the extent they still have them, needs to go is into building more infrastructural connectivity across their boundaries so they can maximize their utility to each other. If you think about how this fits into the broader argument, the Arab world is almost entirely urbanized, right? And people don't voluntarily, or very few, choose to live in hot, dry deserts. Most Arabs live in cities, right? 400 million people mostly live in cities. And they live in countries or societies that either have water, have oil, have energy, have food, or don't, and most of them don't. And the only way they're going to get those resources that they need is actually through a lot more connectivity and a lot less division. So we are a long way from achieving this map, but what worries me so much in everything that we've been fixated on the last 15 years is that we don't have an end game. We don't have a sense of what map should come next. And I believe that it should be a functional map, not just a political map. So this is one to study a lot more closely and talk about more. So now let me get into the competitive dynamics here. Like I said, infrastructure can be a tool of peace building, but it is also the battlefield. It is the way in which we compete over supply chains. Infrastructure connects us, and he who controls the infrastructure, he, she, or which country controls the infrastructure is going to be the one that's going to extract the most benefit from global economic growth in the 21st century. So a lot of it is about trade agreements. So today we hear a lot about TPP and TTIP and the ways in which we are trying to get Asian nations, except for China, to be part of the TPP trade agreement, and whereas China is building something called the RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, and we pit these two against each other as if they're rival geopolitical blocs. So that's the difference between a world in which we think strictly in terms of geopolitical territory and a world in which we think in terms of supply chain connectivity. Because in this new paradigm, you can't strictly isolate geographically countries from being in or out of our trade agreement versus their trade agreement. The way economics works in this sense is that it is additive, it is not substitutive, it is not in fact competitive. And so if you're sitting on Capitol Hill and you're promoting this legislation and you're trying to push the TPP trade agreement because you think that this is going to be the way that you exclude China, for example, and build ties with its neighbors, which in general is a good idea, or at least the part about building relations with neighbors, the problem is that you don't understand the relationship between trade, investment, and supply chains. Because China doesn't have to be a part of the TPP agreement to use special economic zones and industrial parks that it owns in TPP member countries in order to get preferential access to sell into the US market. Right? So if you understand the world in terms of infrastructure and supply chains and investment, rather than just who's in and who's out of some diplomatic or strategic group, you come to a totally different understanding of how competition is playing out in a connected world. And it also, you can see it now in the number of countries for whom China is the #1 trade partner, which is about 124, versus the number of countries for whom we are the top trade partner, which is only 56. So China doesn't have to have 12 aircraft carriers. It doesn't have to have yet modernized fully its strategic arsenal or anything. It doesn't have to be deploying troops as a neo-colonial power in Africa in order to be a global power, right? It is globally significant and relevant because what it has been doing since the 1970s is building these supply chain complementarities, right? It has demand, other countries have supply, particularly commodities. But also now, as those countries grow, they have a demand for electronics or toys or all sorts of other things that China now exports to them. These lines represent not just where China is getting things from, but places where it has built these supply chain connections in order to help to become their largest source of imports as well. And this is an extremely important factor strategically. It's not just an economic thing, because what happens throughout history is that trade agreements become investment agreements become alliances, and so forth. So we have to look very, very carefully at trade patterns as well in a connected world in order to understand the larger strategic picture. So I want to give you a couple of slides that I think represent quote unquote good news. I'm a kid of the 1990s, and I remember immediately after the Berlin Wall fell and the Soviet Union collapsed, of course, we were talking about World War III. You know, what's the next war going to be? I remember the defense policy guidance of '92 and how controversial that was, and we talked about a major peer competitor. And all eyes were already on China. And if you had done a survey at the time, and all of you were probably in the defense establishment then already, we would have all said Taiwan. Taiwan is where World War III is going to happen, right? Who didn't think that Taiwan is where World War III was going to happen? Exactly, right? So there was a consensus 25 years ago. So in the process of my research for this book, I said, okay, let's look at every war that's been, major war that's been predicted for the last 25 years. Let's look at major regional conflicts. Let's look at things that we thought would escalate into potentially World War III. So I came up with 9 examples: China, Taiwan, China, Japan, Iran, Russia, US, China, China and ASEAN, North and South Korea, China, India, India, Pakistan. If there are more, give a shout. But about 9 major conflicts. And as much tension as we are currently worried about and facing and preparing for in many of these situations, none of them have yet become World War III over the last 25 years. And I certainly can't guarantee that they won't. But what I can point to you is that the world of today is very different from 100 years ago, where only trade interdependence was the sort of tripwire or barrier to escalation. We all know that World War I broke out, even though Britain and Germany traded a lot with each other. Well, today is quantitatively, qualitatively different from that time. We not only trade a lot with our rivals. We didn't trade much with the Soviet Union. We trade a lot with China, right? But now we have financial integration on top of that, right? We own a lot of their debt, public and private and corporate. They own a lot of our debt, right? We invest a lot in each other. We own fixed assets in our rivals' geographies. They own a lot of assets and are buying a lot more in our geography. Then we have supply chain dispersal, right? We actually make things in our rivals' geographies, and they make things in ours. So we have trade interdependence, financial integration, foreign investment, supply chain dispersal. There is a lot more barriers to conflicts escalating today than there was 100 years ago. So I find that in each of these situations, as much as we have feared, perhaps rightly, that they would escalate into World War III, there's always been this sense among decision makers and leaders that there's a lot more at stake than there was 100 years ago. So in each of these situations, what I found is that there's a lot more that is restraining leaders than there would have been in other circumstances. So I think we have to remember that as much as, again, we should be worried about escalation in all of these situations, we should also focus on doing a lot more of the things that are preventing that escalation from boiling over. And that something is building a lot more connectivity. And we can talk through any one of these if you like to think about the dynamics. I'll give you just one example. This is the calculus that you would be here in New Delhi today if you're thinking about the relations with China. Of course, again, since the 1990s, we've been trying to build up India as a counterbalance to China. And India has certainly wanted, to some extent, to be that balance. They're worried about their border disputes. They're worried about China building a corridor through Pakistan to reach the Arabian Sea and their alliance with Pakistan. They're worried about China damming the rivers that ultimately feed their agricultural supply and nourish their civilization. On the other hand, their trade has reached $80 billion a year. Chinese foreign investment is rising in India in critical sectors like power and infrastructure, and they're even building a physical trade corridor from northeastern India through Bangladesh and Myanmar to southern China. So now the calculus in New Delhi and Beijing is a little bit different than it would have been in the 1960s when they fought a major war. Now it's about saying, let's hold off a bit on these territorial disputes that have been outstanding for 50 years. We still are angry with each other about the maps. We still have disputes. We still have border incursions, and we're still building up our militaries at breakneck pace. However, we are getting more and more billions of dollars every year from the other in foreign investment and trading more and more with them, so let's just keep it cool. The more of this we encourage, the more of this happens organically between these countries, the better off these situations are going to be. But I want to just jump to fast forward, if you will. You know, the map I showed you of the world's demographic distribution in the year 2030, you know, I won't need to change that map 15 years from now. You can, or 14 years from now. Those are what the population centers will be. This is also a map of the year 2030. If all of the projects of the Chinese-led Asia Infrastructure and Investment Bank come together. So the paradigm of geopolitics in this infrastructurally united world is what I call competitive connectivity. And as I've said, infrastructure is the tool, the weapon almost by which a grand strategy is exercised. And there's no better example of that than what China is doing with the AIIB. You all heard about the AIIB for the first time in the year 2015, probably, when it was announced. But I can tell you, as someone who's been traveling in the Central Asian former Soviet republic since the late 1990s, that China has been engaging in this infrastructure as a tool of extending influence literally since the day the Soviet Union collapsed, so 25 years on. The AIIB is just the newest name for something that China has been doing already for a quarter century. So if you're just waking up to it now, you need to catch up. You need to understand that no matter what's happening in the Chinese economy right now, no matter how much their economic growth is slowing, no matter what overcapacity problems they have, trust me, they're going to continue with this program of building infrastructure across their neighbors in order to reach all the way to Europe. And Europe is very happy to build in the opposite direction. When, you know, we all love geography here. Who in the third grade, fourth grade, fifth grade, were you told that Europe is, you know, the continents of the world are North America, South America, Europe, Asia, Africa, right? You were taught that Europe and Asia are different continents? Does that make any sense? Last time I checked, it's one geological formation, one really big one, the biggest one in the world. They may be different cultural zones, but they are one continent. And what is happening in our lifetimes right now is that it's finally getting connected. Now, already as we sit here, Europe's trade with China is almost equivalent to Europe's trade with America. Our deep cultural transatlantic bonds and trade relations and history and alliance are one thing, but their common geography, which they are now connecting across, is going to massively accelerate what is already a huge amount of trade equivalent to Europe's trade with us. And that's before all these iron Silk Roads are built of railways and pipelines and so forth. And every year, a new corridor, a new trade corridor is being built across this region. And you can see that the countries that we have tried very hard to isolate, whether it's Central Asian countries or Iran, are all getting connected. A Chinese railway arrived in Iran just a couple of weeks ago, and there's more on the way. There's pipelines being built from the Caspian Sea, potentially to India, and so on and so on. I assure you that eventually, just about every single railway, pipeline, electricity grid, and hydro canal on this map is going to get built, because I've been looking at it for the last 20 years, and I've been seeing that these projects eventually get done because they're in China's interest to avoid the Strait of Malacca for importing energy, and because they accelerate the flow of goods westward to Europe. And again, Europe is all too eager to participate in this. Now, I call this the new Iron Age in terms of the infrastructure that's being built. Let me show you how China is doing this in different ways. On the upper left, that's sort of a historical analogy to the Dutch Empire. The way that China operates, as I said, is not necessarily through extending its military reach worldwide, but rather, at least right now, in this phase of its extension of influence around the world, it's through building special economic zones in many different geographies, such as in Africa and even Latin America. And that's something that the Dutch Empire did in the 17th century. So there's a whole chapter of the book that explains the parallel between the Dutch of the 17th century and the Chinese of today. On the right-hand side, this is the stuff that we're watching now every single day with our satellite imagery and what our Navy is focused on as we conduct freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea. What we're contending with is the usage of 21st century technologies, or late 20th century technologies, to sort of advance this agenda of using infrastructure as a tool of geopolitical influence. And we have to start to understand how these technologies throw off our conceptions around sovereignty and territory. Because the CNOC 981 oil rig, the one that's been probing in the Paracel Islands, and then when the Vietnamese stage lots of protests, they suddenly withdraw it and pull it out, but then they just come back in again and so forth. Well, we didn't have mobile oil rigs like that, hundreds of years ago, not even 50 years ago. But we have them today, and China is building more of them. Similarly, I make a joke here about sand. So, for all the money that we can spend on defense and hardware, it turns out that their geopolitical weapon of choice in the South China Sea is just dredging sand. Silica, of course, being the most abundant element in the Earth's crust, proves to be a very useful tool of building de facto control over geography, while the de jure international legal negotiations simply drag on and on. And they'll certainly continue to do this when you have the simple sand dredging technology that will allow you to turn tiny atolls into fortified islands. You're going to use it. And that, again, confounds our thinking about the relationship between military technology, infrastructure, and geopolitics. And I expect more of this to happen. So I'm going to wind down with just a couple of points about what the long-term consequences are of building all of this connectivity across geographies. And I'll start by looking at the example of how Europe is dealing with Russia right now. When we look at the Ukraine situation, most of what we see is the Russian occupation of the Donetsk province and seizure of Crimea. And that's true, it happened, and it's horrible. But the long-term issue that is at stake for Russia and for Ukraine and for Europe is the role of the oil and gas pipelines that flow through Ukraine to the west. What's happening in the long term is, again, no matter what happens with the control over specific geographies, such as Donetsk or Crimea, is that Russia is actually engaging in building more pipelines, which is something that Germany wants, that Scandinavian countries want, and so forth. More oil and gas pipelines, such as Nord Stream, also South Stream, and so forth. Some of these get put on hold, some of these get delayed, but there is a growing volume of gas infrastructural connectivity. And what that does is allow for, in the long run, this connectivity to actually undermine Russia's foreign policy of isolating Ukraine, because what can happen is that as the Nord Stream pipeline comes online, we're able to do reverse flows so that northern European countries can redirect gas supplies from Russia back into Ukraine from the west. And that's something that, if you think about it, is not what Russia wants when it wants to isolate Ukraine, but by building all of this connectivity, we get to actually control and redirect the gas flows back into Ukraine. So what's the lesson in this? A world of greater infrastructural connectivity is a world where it's very difficult to isolate a rival or an enemy or a target state. And so Russia is finding that even though it wants to isolate Ukraine, it's also simultaneously building all of the connectivity that helps us undermine what they are trying to do. So more connectivity ultimately serves our interests. And already, of course, our ability to sell natural gas because of our LNG exports to the Baltic countries is helping to bail them out, and hence they're building and repurposing refineries to import American LNG. So an investment in this kind of dual-use infrastructure, if you will, ultimately serves our strategic purposes, even though it is also a way in which countries project influence. If you take the kind of long-term view, if you think about our concerns and grand strategy over maritime choke points, of the 4 major ones in the world, I've left the Panama Canal off here, the 3 that are the most geopolitically volatile, if you will, the Suez Canal, Straits of Hormuz, Straits of Malacca. These are the 3 choke points where, of course, we perpetually worry about a geopolitical confrontation and the impact that that would have on the free flow of commerce and of energy flows. But today, as a result of what China is doing with trans-Eurasian energy and transportation corridors, and because of the melting of the polar ice caps and our ability to do Arctic shipping, we now have, if you will, more pathways, which is another way of saying more resilience to geopolitical shocks in these geographies. So again, you could look at what China is doing with its infrastructure build-out in Eurasia and say, this is a nefarious exercise in colonizing foreign countries through infrastructure and acquiring its raw materials and controlling its supply chains. And yes, it is. At the same time, it is building these trade corridors that allow for goods, energy, and other sorts of and other things that we trade with each other, to have a pathway of getting across Eurasia in the event of a geopolitical shock to the system. So interestingly enough, even though Libya has fallen apart, we have tensions with Iran, there was obviously the war with Russia and Ukraine and so forth. Oil prices have been falling and falling. It has a lot to do, of course, with our huge increased capacity in energy production, and also because it's very difficult for one particular one geography of unrest or violence to derail global energy markets, because we not only have more supply, but we also have more connectivity. So this is another example of how a world that's more connected is going to be more resilient, and we are not going to necessarily have to fight in every single geography where there may be a disruption. And again, 10 years ago, you all had books on your shelves that talked about the end of oil, peak oil, the coming resource wars. We were supposed to be fighting a war by now with China in the Middle East over oil and gas, or in Africa over minerals. Instead, as many of you well know, last month the first delivery of American crude oil arrived in China. So today in Beijing, they're saying, okay, our energy security strategy is not how do we fight with America in the Middle East over oil, it's how do we buy more oil from America. Again, more connectivity of infrastructure, more connectivity of markets actually creates a situation that's more stable. So it's a double-edged sword, if you will, this world of global connectivity. These are the pathways that can help us to grow our economies, to maximize our collective system, to allow populations to urbanize and to trade more with each other and grow wealthier. But they're also the tools by which influence expands, and the ways in which we also have to think about as a isolated continent, if you will, from the majority of the world's population. How are we going to be more connected to them, to have more influence over them? And in the end, isolation is not going to work as well as engaging and connecting with infrastructure, with trade, with finance, and so forth. So that is just a very, very brief, although I took up all my time, overview of some of the arguments in connectography. I want to thank you for letting me join you here this morning, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you. Thank you.
Great job. All right. Nobody gets away without answering at least one question. Parag, we had a number of people send in questions about the implications of functional geography as opposed to political geography on the work that we do, on intelligence. Our goal is to reduce uncertainty and prepare our leaders and hopefully forestall warfare, and if that doesn't work, then to conclude warfare as quickly as possible. What you've described really raises questions about tensions between the nation-state world order, and I'm only about a third of the way through your book, but I don't think I've seen that term yet. So your political geography as opposed to where we're moving in functional geography. How do we think about that different type of world, different dynamic from an intelligence perspective?
So, history is additive, right? It's not that sovereignty is replaced, but we have to think about sovereignty, we have to think about infrastructure, technology, finance, supply chains. All of these are layers and layers that make the world more complicated. And hence, I try to make these maps as absolutely complicated as possible, showing everything that we have built to try to map on human geography, our distribution demographically into the cities, the connectivity we're building across them, and the borders that we have. And that's obviously, I'm sure you'd appreciate the truer picture of what is going on. So functional geography and political geography have to be seen in tandem, not as one superseding the other. There are going to be situations such as what I call the 9 wars that weren't, tensions, situations where functional geography ultimately helps to forestall political tensions. But the point is that because the number of active, hostile, international border conflicts has fallen to nearly 0, we have to focus on the tensions and conflicts that are going to arise over these infrastructures. So I write about the sort of backlash against China, for example. What I've done over the years is just look at every single instance in the last particularly 10 years where there's been anti-Chinese backlash because China has such an overwhelming economic presence in developing countries. It controls 80% of the investment into and 80% of the exports out of countries like Myanmar. There are countries like Sri Lanka or Zambia or Ecuador that are massively indebted now to China, while China has offered to build out their mineral sector, their energy sector, and so forth. What's going to happen when if we want to predict, if you will, the instability that's going to arise in the dynamics between China and those countries, is to actually look at who controls the infrastructure. Because you have situations where, in Zambia, in various mineral mines, they've taken Chinese managers and executed them, or thrown them down the mine shaft. Right? There are protests against there being too many Chinese workers in a country not creating enough jobs. Protests against not transferring enough technology. Things like that. All of the things that China did to the United States and Western investors going into China. Give us your technology, hire our workers, do all your manufacturing here. Those countries now want China to do dealing with them. So there's a lot of tensions there, and the tension is over the markets. It's over the infrastructure. So we should be looking at things like the amount of debt default, for example, that may happen between local companies and their Chinese investors, for example. What's going to happen if China wants to take control of those assets? I've also written about something that I'm sure you would know very well, which is China's usage of private military contractors, or embedding troops in UN peacekeeping operations in order to monitor oil-producing infrastructures in Sudan and other places. So infrastructure is the site of that geopolitical tension. So we have to be watching that as or more closely than we're watching political boundaries today. And that's going to help us, it's definitely going to help us predict where the greatest tensions are going to break out.
Which leads to many additional questions that we'll let Robert Cardillo answer when he comes up. Did I do that okay, Sue? Parag, I think you're going to be signing your book. I highly recommend it. As I said, I'm about a third of the way through. I'm going to bring my iPad and have you sign that since I downloaded. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Parag.